Gaming History 101.
The year was 1994, and video games had crept their way into popular culture. While on the home consoles, the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo were offering very dynamic experiences, it was clear that at the arcades, the fighter ruled supreme. Street Fighter II came in 1991, and at this point it was on its fourth iteration with Super Street Fighter II. Meanwhile, Mortal Kombat was celebrating its first sequel. It was only a matter of time until clones snuck their way into the marketplace, and of those first clones, Primal Rage emerged from Atari Games. Basically, it was a post-apocalyptic game where prehistoric gods fought it out for the new Earth that had been created. Frankly, it doesn't take much creativity to criticize this game. However, anyone who was around the arcades at the time knows just what kind of joy there was by seeing Primal Rage. I mean, come on, let's face it, it's dinosaurs fighting each other. What's not to like? Among the 7 gods in the character selection screen, the first was known as Armadon. He was also known as Spike in the prototype version. He was the god of life. He fights to defend Earth, now respelled URTH, and prevent its destruction at the hands of the evil gods. He's kind of known as a Tristegosauratops in design documents, but that's a mouthful and pretty hard to say. Next on the list was Blizzard. He was known as Kong in the prototype version. He was the god of good and virtue. Basically, he's one of the 2 ape-like beasts, and he's not quite unlike Mortal Kombat's Sub-Zero. His species was Absidius, and he was basically a palette swap with Chaos, who we'll get to in the future. Next up was Sauron, the god of hunger. He basically resembled a Tyrannosaurus, but he was considered a Pteranodon as his species, and he basically emulated Godzilla to a pretty fine tee. And last of the good gods was Talon, the god of survival. He was Deinonychosauria, but more specifically, he was a velociraptor. He's the shortest character, but ironically enough, has the longest range and is quite an interesting fighter. And then of the 7 characters, there were the 3 evil gods. First and foremost was Diablo. He was the god of evil and destruction. Of course, he resembles a Tyrannosaurus, and basically he's a palette swap with Sauron. His big thing is he spews fire. Everything about him is fire-based. He's dark red, he has purple stripes, he shoots fire, he breathes fire, and he doesn't have that uncommon of a characteristic to Scorpion. So there's Diablo. Next is Vertigo, our first female character and only female character in this, which really starts to draw some parallels to Mortal Kombat, but she is the goddess of insanity. Now, she's a weird lizard-like creature. She is called the Dromaeosaurid dinosaur. But mostly she's a king cobra, brought with like 4 arms and legs. But she's interesting. She's got kind of unique, almost Medusa-like aspects to her. And we'll kind of see some controversy when she gets removed from certain versions. Now, the last one I have waited to mention because this is Chaos, the god of decay. The reason I waited till the end is because Chaos is probably the most popular character in Primal Rage, and the reasons are somewhat juvenile. Chaos likes to do all the gross things that really entices the interests of boys from the age of like 12 to 17. What I mean by that is Chaos has vomiting as one of his special moves. Another one is farting. His third special move is he jumps across the map and butt bounces you with a fart. Not only that, he was one of the biggest reasons why there was controversy surrounding this game. And most importantly, he had a fatality where he literally took a nuclear piss on you. He pissed on you and there was nothing but bones left. This got a lot of parents on edge, and of course, like with Mortal Kombat, didn't mean much in the arcades, but the second this came home, which we will get to in a minute, it really drew some controversy. I hate to say it, but the fact that Chaos is the most popular, most pivotal, and most influential character of the series, and basically the front runner of what represents Primal Rage, kind of speaks to the fact that it was mostly loved by teenage boys, and kind of still proves that in the mid-90s, it was a teenage boy world where mostly you were marketing to that audience. Anyway, let's move on to what the game did that was somewhat influential compared to other games. At its core, Primal Rage is through and through a Mortal Kombat clone. This means that there's plenty of blood spurting out in various activities or attacks that happen mid-round. And then, of course, if you win both rounds, you do get an opportunity to perform a fatality. Mortal Kombat 2 had already hit the market and brought with it multiple fatalities per character, babalities, friendships, and all kinds of crazy ways to finish a round. But it was pretty clear that Primal Rage based itself off of the original Mortal Kombat, and that only had one fatality per character. It's for this reason that I'm sure the developers thought they were forward-thinking by having multiple fatalities, but unfortunately the fact that they were integrated into Mortal Kombat 2, which was sitting right next to Primal Rage in arcades, I bet most audience members didn't notice. There's some interesting moves here. It has a high and low attack, both a quick and fierce version of them. So it's basically Mortal Kombat without a block button. But the unique part, and unfortunately the biggest weakness of this game, is that in order to do special moves and fatalities, you basically hold down 2 to 4 of the special attack buttons and then do a motion. So for example, if you wanted to do Chaos's Fart, you would hold down attack 2 and 3. You'll know them by the grid if you study up on Primal Rage, and then move in a down and back motion, and you will perform it. Later in time, this will prove to be a detriment to the game, and it will actually be substituted with a more traditional scheme where you perform the movements and then press the button. However, the original scheme was left intact, thankfully, for those that had mastered it. I mean, all in all, comparing it to other games, it is kind of a clumsy fighter. There's no rhyme or reason as to how you hit one another. There's kind of a toss-up as to what attack hits what. I give it credit for special moves not being as influential or necessary as they are in Street Fighter 2 or Mortal Kombat, but still, it's just really kind of chaotic, to be honest with you. You never feel like you're in control of what you're doing. Furthermore, the moves take off very little life, so life bars end up extending far beyond the 60-second rounds. So oftentimes when you're fighting one another, especially if you're teamed up against somebody who has somewhat of an understanding as to how to play the game, you can frequently have rounds end before either of you wins. Now, if one of you does win, then of course there's the interesting animations and the ways to get the forefront. There's also villagers that get tossed into the scene from time to time. If you eat your own, you actually hurt yourself because they're your worshippers as a god. But if you eat one of the other villagers for the opposing god, you actually gain life. It sounds cool at first, but it's kind of stupid because you don't really gain much life. You gain even less, and then it just extends a round that's already ready to end. More importantly, you have to hold all the attack buttons and do a motion in order to grab a character, and so the likeliness that you'll ever be able to grab them is pretty slim. But, in the end, once you start getting an understanding of the flow of combat and start going for it and learning the lackluster combo system that at best is 3 hits, you can make a name for yourself. It also depends on which version you do. On a lot of the home console versions, you're playing pretty clumsy because it just doesn't have decent controls. But on the more arcade perfect versions, it works out. And if you ever get an opportunity to play with a joystick, I highly recommend it. In the end, I give the development team at Atari Games a lot of credit. They used stop-motion animation in some very decent characters to make for an enticing fighting game that had a ugly-as-hell cabinet. But once you break it all down, you can kind of see why Primal Rage didn't have much of a future. There should also be some notation given to the version differences, especially when it gets to the home console ports. Primal Rage was consistently updated with different quote-unquote ROM versions, which are different versions of the PCB board that were in the arcade. But unlike most new iterations, it didn't constitute an actual sequel or new arcade cabinet. They were just upgraded without you even knowing any better. So, for example, from 1.0 to 1.4, which were some of the earliest versions, there were lots of glitches and weird errors that were taken care of in the 1.7 version. Ironically enough, the most notable version that is basically the most playable of the arcade ports is version 2.3. Now, 2.3 was interesting because 2.3 censored out some items. I can't really speak to what was censored because it's kind of weird how they went about doing it. But I can tell you Chaos's controversial fatality is still in there and various other things, but I think it's most notable because it had a weird... it is what all the home console ports, save for the Sega Genesis version and 32X version, were based off of. The other interesting thing was it had a weird kind of like piracy protection that extends into almost every, emulated or copied version of this game. which turns some of the blood in certain attacks to like peach colored. It almost looks like vomit. And if you emulate it on MAME, that's kind of the only workable version, and those glitches are definitely in there. Ironically enough, the Midway Treasures 2 collection, which came out on the Xbox, PS2, and GameCube, was said to have a arcade perfect port of this, but even they didn't know about the copyright protection, because if you look at it on any of these console versions, it has all of this weird discoloration and whatever random censorships are in it removed as well. What it did do, though, on the plus side, was add, typically for most characters, a third fatality, and all of those are intact in every version other than the Sega Genesis version. So it goes back and forth, but it's definitely why when somebody asks you what are kind of the best versions of this on home consoles, there's various different answers. But in short, MAME is not the first way to go on this. It's very difficult to get the 2.3 to play in older versions of MAME, which a lot of legacy cabinets and various other collectors use. And then on the newer versions where you can get it to work, it's this janky, kind of glitched version. I think it's kind of odd that none of the developers of the original game wanted to kind of help out. But I also think that crack may not be that difficult, having no knowledge truly about how to do it. And so I'm betting if it was a more pivotal game, then maybe it would have been worked out. But it's just a lot of work for very little change. Anyway, in 1995, Primal Rage came home. And there was a lot of interesting things about it. First and foremost, the different versions that were used, the different developers that were used, and last but not least, the fact that it had a teen rating. Now, for the record, given that you're comparing it to other games of this time, I have no idea why it had a teen rating, because while the violence might have been animal on animal, there was plenty of human violence and a lot of mature content that never should have been allowed in a teen-rated game. Still, it came home, so now let's sit down with the version portion of this episode and look at how Primal Rage came home. Given the fact that it came out in 1995 and the relative popularity in arcades, Primal Rage was ported to many cartridge and CD-based consoles. If I were to go off the list offhand, I would say it was on the Sega Genesis, the 32X, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, the Game Boy, the Game Gear, came to the 3DO, the Atari Jaguar CD for some interesting reasons, and then it also came to the Saturn and, of course, the PlayStation 1. Now, given the wide range of ports, I think it's important to compare like things. For that reason, we're going to be comparing the 16-bit console versions together, so that would be the Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo, and the 32X version. On the portable front, the Game Boy and Game Gear were actually developed by the same group, and so I've been told that the Game Boy and Game Gear differ in only one way, which is that of color. And unfortunately, I don't have a Game Gear version, and I didn't find a good way to compare the two. So we will look at the Game Boy version, but I don't have a Game Gear comparison. And then last but not least, we have the 32-bit consoles. Now, given the fact that Jaguar CD with Primal Rage will cost you more than $500, which can net you probably 2 or more arcade cabinets, I'm not going to be comparing those because I just don't have access to them. And so in the end, I'm going to be comparing the 3DO and the Saturn version. So without further ado, let's kick it off with the 16-bit comparison, which was probably the most common version that everybody owned. In getting started, the Genesis port does appear to be one of the weakest ports of this game, although that doesn't surprise me much because 32-bit consoles were becoming all the rage, so it would stand to logic that the 16-bit consoles would suffer a bit. Having said that, the Genesis is probably the most popular console this game was played on, and I say that because if you were big into fighting and definitely big into violence, the culmination of that would be Mortal Kombat in '93, so you're probably going to stick around for the Primal Rage. This version is based off of the 1.7 version of the arcade, which is apparently a good thing. From what I hear, all the censorship is removed, and it does not have the third fatality for a lot of the characters, but other than that, it is the quote-unquote best version of this game to come out. The reason I kind of use air quotes is because I don't see much of a difference. The game doesn't seem a whole lot more gory, in fact, maybe even a little less so than 2.3. And I don't really know what was censored out. I'm sure there is somewhere somebody who looked over the finer points and pointed them out, but for me, it just appears to be the good enough port. Now, this is all assuming you're looking at it from a visual standpoint. I mean, the sprites are low, the color scheme does not look great. It's just kind of muddy. And if you thought Chaos sounded farty before, wait till you hear them on the Genesis chip. But what it lacks in graphical prowess and sound design, it definitely makes up for in play. And this is something that was very common for many games of this time period, including Mortal Kombat, which was that it might not have looked as good, but it sure played like the arcade, and Primal Rage is no exception. Additionally, it was developed by Probe Software, who had also handled the Mortal Kombat port, and there are plenty of Easter eggs. So if you do the lovely cheat code, and just for posterity's sake, I will put it in the video right here, so it's probably somewhere on the screen glowing. But it had these cheat codes, and while the Super Nintendo did have them, there is a specific one where if you pick it, I believe it says "you serious" or something, or "you joking," and then you pick Diablo, you'll see CEO of Probe Software, Fergus McGovern, who was also the Fergality in Mortal Kombat 2, as a little devil that's kind of chanting by your side as opposed to, the little cave people that were worshiping the gods. So it's a fun little Easter egg. It doesn't mean that, like, if you have your choice, you go for one over the other. But frankly, if I'm going to pick, I will probably go with this one over the SNES port, which is probably the worst, but we're really splitting hairs. Anyway, on that note, moving on to the SNES port, it looked great. It looked very similar to the arcade, much like the original Mortal Kombat did. The problem is it suffered many problems in terms of speed. It dropped a lot of frames. It's kind of clunky. It moved slow and sluggish. And that is really a problem when you're trying to do a fighting game. I think frame rate is boss when it comes to fighting games, and this ruins it. It makes moves very hard to pull off. Good luck to you. I was never able to pull off, except for once, a fatality, and I'll talk about that in a second. But and it was apparently censored, although I'm sure you'll see it's plenty violent. I don't understand what some of the complaints were. The one random difference that was made on the SNES port was they did remove Chaos's urine fatality. So as you can probably see here on the video, when you go to do it, you just get this weird sensor bar up in the, kind of like the circle, the red circle with the slash through in the top center of the screen. You wouldn't even know you were doing it unless you were the person who spent all this time trying to do it, because we probably haven't talked about it. Fatalities are kind of difficult in Primal Rage. You have to hold down 2 buttons for Chaos, push 2 directions, then hold down all 4 buttons and push 2 more directions, or 3 or 4. I don't know. Anyway, it's a lot of movement in order to do a fatality, so it's kind of annoying. It's also why you'll see them featured every single time I pulled them off, which was only a handful of times in the capturing of all these videos. So yeah, while I think it looks fantastic, the fact that it's sluggish and it drops frames and it doesn't feel right kind of puts the SNES at the bottom. Finally, there is the 32X version. Now, they resampled all the sounds that were in this version, so that's why it sounds a lot better. And as I'm sure you can tell, it looks a lot better. It looks a lot more like the SNES version. In fact, it might even be a little bit better. And it is the last of the versions we will look at here, other than the portables, that will lack load times, which is a huge deal. Again, I don't remember if it's based off of 1.7 or 2.3, and that's my point. As we sit here and nitpick all this stuff, nobody notices. Like, it looks good on a Wikipedia article, but no one ever really cares. The point being is, the 32X definitely makes up for itself on this fighting game, and it plays just like the Genesis version, if not a little bit better. The frame rate's tight, the controls are tight, and so it kind of helps, much like Mortal Kombat 2, kind of bridge that gap. But I think even more so with Primal Rage than Mortal Kombat 2. Mortal Kombat 2 looked okay, but you can still see those visual flaws, whereas Primal Rage is pretty much intelligible versus the other. So again, if you're going for cartridge base, you don't want load times, this is probably the best port you're going to get, and it's relatively fantastic. So moving on, we're going to look at some of the comparison videos of these different 16-bit versions running, and then we'll move on to the portable versions. Now, on the portable front, these games kind of speak for themselves. You can see in the gameplay here. Thanks to the shadowing of the Game Boy and a pretty decent job by Probe, the game looks pretty tip-top. Surprisingly enough, it controls quite well. In addition, anybody who's played a fighting game on the portable consoles, I'm looking mostly at you, Mortal Kombat, will note that it doesn't work out very well. And the characters always seem kind of jagged and floaty in their movements and how they fight. Whereas Primal Rage, because it focused less on the special moves and kind of defining attacks, and everybody is kind of distinct within this pantheon of fighters, it really works to the benefit of the Game Boy and also the Game Gear. I'm told the Game Gear is almost a direct port. It was, unlike with Mortal Kombat, it was done by Probe on both consoles. And the movesets and everything are the same, so they're pretty much direct. While I don't have any gameplay to show you, if you want to imagine the Game Gear version, you can just basically picture this in color. But yeah, very impressive. If you want a portable version of Primal Rage, this is about the only version that you can pick up, but it's very faithful. So I got to give it credit. It's more fun to play than most portable fighters I've dealt with outside of the Neo Geo Pocket. The only big notable difference between the two games is on the Sega Game Gear, Chaos's infamous urine fatality is intact, just like the arcade, whereas oddly enough on the Game Boy he vomits on you to make you turn into bones, which sounds just as bad, if not worse. But anyway, as you can see, it's an impressive feat. If you can pick up a version of this and you have an appreciation for something like that and don't have a Neo Geo Pocket Color, this would be the way to go. All right, and lastly, we'll move on to the 32-bit CD-based consoles. They were predominantly the same because they were all developed by Probe Software. Now, because of the intro that you're about to see here on the 3DO that goes on for just over a minute, there is no sound. So it's not that I've muted anything, it's just that they didn't include it, which is kind of weird because you think your disc is flawed when you first see it. Now, fortunately, this gap allows me to talk about the Jaguar CD version. While emulators like the Tempest 2000 emulator do a decent job of capturing this game, the sound is always messed up when I look at these versus the version I've seen in play. So it's not really an accurate portrayal of the game proper. But apparently if you have a Jaguar CD, this is the version to get. In the meantime, these other 32-bit versions are the ones I have to compare, and they all seem pretty decent in comparison to the arcade. There are new CGI cutscenes, including the intro you're about to see, which covers the events from the arcade, but throws in a little bit of good old mid-90s 3D flair for effect, I guess. Enjoy.
I remember of yesterday back, before the great ones ruled earth. Afore the darkness, behind the stars of night, there were a great fire running in the sky. It spreads like the wind hot within its path, destruction for all. Becoming mightier as it go, the great fire hurls through space, none to know the world it brings. Space was full of old planets and giant tumbling pieces of worlds before, line the path of the great fire, into a giant old star. The great fire crashed with a mighty crash, exploding to everywhere, streak asteroids of burning rock and fire. Blue skies burned with the fury of the great fire. All around, I hear streets cry out loud, mountains rumble, as buildings explode, my home erupts. This world would never again be the same. New Earth would rise up from the rubble, out of the smoky landscape. The cataclysm awakes the sleeping giants from ancient worlds. Crashing through the barriers of time, they invade our world, to conquer, to rule the whole human race. They rise to devour us. We kneel to worship them. They never stop, only to seek others, for battle, for ultimate world domination. For Primal Rage.
So there you have it. The game itself is pretty faithful to the arcade version, even on the 3DO, which was one of the first versions released. However, one of the most notable setbacks is the introduction to load times. By my count, the load times are pretty severe, where you get 10 to 12 seconds of load time for the 3DO, over 20 seconds for the Saturn, and somewhere in between for the PlayStation. Just to give a light example, here's what you can expect from just the 3DO version, which from what I can tell, loads the fastest. And once a round starts... No, that was not an error in the capture. That's the big delay between when Rage shows up on the screen and when Rage is actually spoken out loud. Aside from that, the 3DO version is pretty decent. All of the music from the arcade is streamed out. The violence seems intact. I don't know if it's based off the 1.7 or the 2.3 version, but it really doesn't matter. It looks, plays, and feels impressively like the arcade. And given the fact that there were only 4 buttons on the arcade and that the 3DO had 2 shoulder buttons and 3 main buttons, everything is accounted for and works pretty smoothly. In fact, the 3DO is probably one of the better versions of this port, given the fact that there are load times. But still, if you have this particular console, it's worthwhile to grab it. Now, moving forward, let's go on to the PlayStation. The PlayStation actually walks, talks, and acts like a perfect version of the arcade. I mean, you can see here, now granted, I've up-resed this a little bit. I'm playing this on a PS2, which is ported over to 720p through an up-res or upscaler. Anyway, having said that, the PlayStation 1 version just looks gorgeous, and it seems to be the most arcade perfect version, except for one big flaw. Yeah, in that nearly 10-second gap, if you didn't hear any music in the background, that's because, frankly, the PlayStation 1 does not do it. I don't know if it was a glitch or something in the system, but I know the audio is present. But whatever the reason, when you play this on an actual PlayStation 1, the audio does not stream when you fight. That's a big problem, and that is what I consider to be one of the major flaws of this game that prevent it from being one of the recommended ports for it. Frankly, if you can't hear the music that plays in the background, there's very little reason to really get into this game. You hear the random cheering and the growls and grunts and whatnot, but it's a complete experience, and it's always had to do with some sort of background music. Now, apparently there's a problem with the streaming, which is why you hear this on a PlayStation 1 or PlayStation 2 in my case. Apparently on a PlayStation 3, if you play this through, you will hear the music stream properly, although I didn't really hear that when I played it, but maybe I'm doing something wrong? I don't know. When I take an actual disc and put it into an actual system, I expect it to work as planned. I don't know if there's any finagling to do, but trust me, if it has to do with any sort of glitching or hacking or changing of my code or something that would void the warranty, I'm definitely not going to do it. In closing, the PlayStation 1 version is an impressive, works at full speed, but has weird load times in between matches, and without the music is not the port of choice. So of course that means that, surprisingly enough, the Sega Saturn version is the most impressive port of this game. As you can see, the sprites are big, the characters appear large in the main frame, and weirdly enough, this is captured on composite video. Now, the 3DO version was on S-Video, and the PlayStation 1 version was on an upscaled component video through an upscaler to 720p on the PlayStation 2. This is just regular composite video, and it looks just as good, if not slightly better, than any of these other versions, which proves that the Saturn truly could handle 2D fighters better than anybody else. The Saturn was terrible at 3D effects, but trust me, it reigned supreme when it came to side-scrolling fighters. Anyway, while the load times are redonkulous, you could basically play a game of poker in between them. That's not so bad when it comes down to really playing a definitive version of this game. So if you gotta go for a home console port version, the cheapest and probably best version is on the Sega Saturn. In the meantime, if you have no other choice, you're probably gonna go for the more common, although much more musically impaired, version on the PlayStation 1. Either way, these are all ports of the same game on 3 different platforms, and I'm led to believe that the Jaguar CD is no different. So you're not really compromising yourself in many ways by picking one version over the other. But, in my opinion, the Saturn's the best. But what's your opinion? In closing this video, I'm going to show you all 3 versions playing at the same time, and you can make your own decision. If you have a game that you'd like to see gameplay of, in a long play, or featured in a version where we compare all the home ports of a game, just let us know. Go to gaminghistory101.com/contact and hit us up. In the meantime, check out gaminghistory101.com and happy gaming. Peace out.